I never thought one moment could change everything between us. But then again, I never expected David to walk in at the exact wrong, or maybe the exact right time. David and I had been best friends since freshman year of college. He was the kind of guy who made people feel at ease the moment he walked into a room. Always laughing, always confident, the kind of effortlessly charming person who didn't realize the effect he had on others. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't care. I, on the other hand, had always been quieter, more observant, more aware of the way my stomach twisted when David stretched, shirt riding up just enough to reveal a sliver of toned skin, more aware of the way my heart picked up when his arms slung around my shoulders, casual and thoughtless to him, electrifying to me. It was easy to be close to him. Too easy. That's what made it dangerous. We'd been roommates since our junior year, living in a small off-campus apartment that was a little too cramped, but always filled with energy. He was the messy one, leaving his sneakers in the middle of the floor and his books scattered across the coffee table. I was the organized one, constantly shoving his stuff out of the way so I wouldn't trip over it. It worked. We worked. At least we did. Until that night. It was a humid Friday evening, the kind where the air sticks to your skin and everything feels slow. I had just stepped out of the shower, towel wrapped loosely around my waist, my damp hair clinging to my forehead. I wasn't expecting company. David had said he'd be out late. So when I walked into our room and let the towel drop, the last thing I expected was the sound of the door swinging open behind me. "Yo, you seen my—" David's voice cut off abruptly. I froze. For a long second, neither of us moved. My heart slammed against my ribs as I turned my head just enough to see him standing in the doorway, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. His gaze flickered, just briefly, before he looked away, rubbing the back of his neck like he suddenly forgot why he had come in. I scrambled to grab the towel, wrapping it around myself again, heat rising up my neck. Not just from embarrassment, but from something else. "Dude," he said, finally meeting my gaze, something unreadable flickering in his expression. And just like that, something shifted. David and I had been inseparable since college. We met during our first semester when we got paired for a group project in our Intro to Psychology class. He was the type to charm his way through presentations with confidence alone, while I actually did the research. It should have annoyed me, but somehow it didn't. Somehow we clicked. From there, our friendship was effortless. Late-night food runs, cramming for exams we swore we wouldn't procrastinate on. Endless debates over the best superhero movies. David was the kind of friend who could make any situation feel lighter, always knowing how to turn my overthinking into laughter. Living together only made things more natural. He crashed on my bed as often as he did his own, claiming my mattress was weirdly more comfortable than his. He stole my hoodies even though we were practically the same size, and somehow, over time, his presence became something I relied on, something I needed. But there was always something just beneath the surface, something I knew I could never acknowledge. The way my heart beat just a little too fast when he flopped down beside me, his leg pressed against mine. The way my stomach clenched whenever he ruffled my hair, his touch lingering just a second longer than necessary. I told myself it was just admiration, just a phase, just nothing, until the nothing started feeling like everything. The weekend that changed everything had started as just another plan, one of our many spontaneous ideas. "Dude, we need a break," David had said, stretching out on the couch while I sat at my desk, pretending to focus on an assignment. Like a real break. No school, no stress, just us and the open road. I barely looked up. "And where exactly are we driving to? Does it matter?" He grinned, tossing a pillow at me. "Come on, man. You, me, a weekend getaway. Let's just get in the car and figure it out as we go." I wanted to say no. I really did. Because being alone with David for an entire weekend, with nothing to distract me from the way he made my pulse stutter, it was a terrible idea. But then he gave me that look, the one that made it impossible to refuse him. So I caved. We left Friday afternoon with a vague plan of heading toward the mountains, stopping whenever something looked interesting. It was supposed to be easy, fun, just another adventure. But of course, nothing ever went that smoothly with David. I swear, It said there was a gas station like 5 miles back, he muttered, glancing at the GPS. I sighed, crossing my arms. David, did you or did you not ignore my suggestion to fill up the tank before we left? He shot me a sheepish grin. Okay, maybe I did, but in my defense, I thought we had enough to get us there. Define there. Okay, so maybe we're a little lost. A little? Relax, we'll figure it out. He turned to me, his grin shifting into something softer. It's not like being stranded in the middle of nowhere with me is the worst thing in the world, right? I tried to roll my eyes, but the truth was, I didn't actually mind. Being stuck with David meant more time with him, just the two of us, away from everything else. But that was the problem, wasn't it? Because with every mile we drove, with every glance he shot me when he thought I wasn't looking, with every small touch that sent my thoughts spiraling, being alone with David wasn't the worst thing. It was the best. And that scared me more than anything. The gas station was nowhere in sight, and with every passing mile, the fuel gauge dipped closer to empty. The sun had started setting, casting long shadows across the empty road as we drove deeper into nowhere. The mountains in the distance loomed closer, but civilization? Nowhere to be found. David drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, glancing at me with a forced grin. So, worst case scenario, we run out of gas and have to hike to find help. I exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of my nose. I knew I should have driven. Hey, in my defense, this is kind of exciting. Feels like one of those survival movies. Two guys, lost in the wilderness, depending on each other to make it through the night. I didn't respond, because the way he said it, depending on each other, settled too deep in my chest, curling around something I'd spent years trying to ignore. 15 minutes later, the car sputtered and rolled to a stop on the side of the road. Well, David muttered, tapping the dashboard like that would somehow bring the car back to life. We tried. I stared at him. You're an idiot. He grinned. But I'm your idiot. I turned away before he could see the way my face heated. With no gas and no cell signal, our only option was to wait until morning when we could try to flag down another car. The air had cooled significantly, and the isolation was starting to settle in. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the faint hum of crickets somewhere in the distance. David leaned back against the seat, stretching his arms over his head. Guess we're spending the night here. In your car? Unless you want to build a cabin real quick. I shot him a look. We don't even have blankets. We'll manage. He turned to me, a lazy grin playing on his lips. You're warm, right? I swallowed hard. What? He shrugged, unbothered. I mean, if it gets too cold, we could… He made a vague gesture, something between a hug and an awkward half-shrug. You know? Just so we don't freeze to death or whatever? He wasn't being serious. He was just talking. Just saying. Words like he always did. Casual, effortless. But my brain had already gone into overdrive. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. You'll be fine. You always run hot anyway. He smirked. True. I am kinda built different. I rolled my eyes, but the tension had already seeped in, wrapping around us like a vice. The car suddenly felt too small, the air too heavy. Every movement, every shift of his body made me hyper-aware of how close we were. And then, as if the universe was hell-bent on making this situation worse, David sighed and stretched his arms behind his head, his t-shirt riding up just enough to reveal a strip of skin, the faintest hint of his toned stomach. I looked away so fast I nearly gave myself whiplash. This was fine. This was normal. I had shared space with David 1,000 times before. We had crashed on each other's beds, fallen asleep on the couch during movie nights, shared clothes when he stole my hoodies like they were his own. This was nothing. So why did it feel like everything? An hour passed, then another. The temperature had dropped significantly, and despite my best efforts, I was starting to shiver. David noticed. Dude, you're literally shaking. He sat up, frowning. Okay, forget what I said earlier. Come here. I blinked. What? You're cold. I'm warm. Do the math. Before I could protest, he reached over, pulling me toward him without hesitation. I stiffened. Big mistake. Huge mistake. Because suddenly, I wasn't just cold. I was hyper-aware of everything. The heat radiating from his body. The solid press of his chest against mine. The way his arm casually draped over my shoulder like this was the most normal thing in the world. "You're so tense," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. I forced out a laugh, though it came out shaky. "Probably because I didn't think my night would end with you trying to smother me." He chuckled. "Relax. It's just me." That was the problem. It was just him. And him? He was everything. Minutes stretched into something longer. At some point, I stopped shivering. At some point, I stopped thinking about the cold at all. David's breathing had evened out, slow and steady against my shoulder. His body was warm, solid, grounding. I should have moved away. Should have laughed it off, pushed him back into his seat, turned this moment into another joke. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed still. Instead, I let my fingers curl slightly against his hoodie, let my own breathing sink with his. Instead, I let myself pretend, just for a moment, that this wasn't a mistake. That maybe, just maybe, he felt it too. And then, softly, barely above a whisper, he spoke. "You ever think about something for so long that it kind of sneaks up on you?" I swallowed, heart pounding. "What do you mean?" There was a pause, a hesitation, and then, "Nothing," he murmured, voice barely audible. "Never mind." But I knew. I knew. Because for the first time, David sounded uncertain. And David, he was never uncertain. The silence stretched between us, thick with unsaid words. David shifted slightly, his body still pressed against mine. His warmth was intoxicating, overwhelming, making it impossible to focus on anything but the fact that I could feel the steady rise and fall of his chest, the slow rhythm of his breath against my skin. I should have ignored it. I should have laughed, teased him like I always did, turned it into another joke. But I couldn't. Because when he said, "Never mind," when his voice dipped into something hesitant and unfamiliar, something cracked open inside me. I turned my head, slightly, just enough to see his face in the dim light filtering through the windshield. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling of the car, his brows slightly furrowed, like he was stuck in a thought he couldn't shake. I swallowed hard. "What were you going to say?" I asked, keeping my voice quiet, careful. David exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's stupid." I waited. He let out a breathless chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "It's just, I don't know. Lately I've been thinking about things. About us." My heart nearly stopped. "Us?" He hesitated, then nodded. There it was. The weight of it. The thing I'd been terrified of. The thing I'd spent years convincing myself wasn't real. I couldn't breathe. He shifted again, finally turning to look at me. His gaze was unreadable, his lips parted like he was still debating whether to say the words hovering between us. I forced myself to keep my expression neutral, even though my pulse was hammering in my ears. "David, what are you trying to say?" Another pause. His fingers twitched where they rested near mine, close but not touching. "I don't know when it started," he admitted, voice quiet, "but I think about you. A lot." My throat went dry. "I mean, I always have," he continued, as if trying to explain it to himself. "You're my best friend. That's normal, right?" He let out a soft laugh, but it sounded strained. "But lately it's been different. Different." The word echoed between us, settling in the space where all my unsaid feelings lived. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. David ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "God, I sound like an idiot." "No," I said quickly, voice firmer than I expected. "You don't." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do. Because this was it, wasn't it? The moment that could change everything. I could play dumb. I could pretend I didn't understand what he meant. I could keep pretending, keep swallowing everything I felt and burying it beneath layers of friendship and casual touches that were never really casual at all. Or I could tell the truth. The thought terrified me, because the truth meant exposing myself, laying everything out in the open, taking a step I could never take back. But then David did something that shattered my last line of defense. He reached out, hesitantly, slowly, and took my hand. Just that. Just his fingers brushing against mine, curling around them like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to. Like he was afraid I might pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I sucked in a shaky breath and did what I'd been afraid of for years. I squeezed his hand back. The shift in his expression was almost imperceptible, just the smallest intake of breath, the faintest widening of his eyes. But it was there, real, undeniable. "Me too," I whispered. The words barely made it past my lips, but I knew he heard them, because his grip on my hand tightened, because his chest rose in a sharp inhale, because suddenly, he was looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "Yeah?" he asked, voice rough. I nodded. His tongue darted out to wet his lips, and my gaze followed the motion before I could stop myself. The air between us was thick, crackling with something unspoken, something I didn't know how to name but had felt for longer than I wanted to admit. David shifted closer, just enough for our knees to press together. His gaze flickered to my mouth, brief, hesitant, but it was enough to make my breath catch. I didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. Maybe it didn't matter. All I knew was that 1 second, we were staring at each other, and the next, his lips brushed against mine. Soft, hesitant. A question, not a demand. I barely had time to process it before he started to pull back, but I reacted before I could stop myself. I chased the contact, pressing forward, capturing his mouth with mine before he could second-guess it. David made a soft sound, somewhere between a sigh and a hum, and that was all it took for me to fall. Apart, because this wasn't just a kiss. This was years of unsaid words, years of stolen glances, years of pretending I didn't want him, and now there was nothing left to hide. His hand slid up my neck, fingers threading into my hair as he deepened the kiss, his movements growing more confident, more certain. I melted into him, hands gripping his hoodie like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew this was reckless. I knew this was dangerous, but I didn't care. Because David was kissing me, and I was kissing him back. And for the first time in forever, I didn't have to pretend anymore. The kiss lingered between us even after we pulled apart. It was still there in the way our breaths came fast and uneven, in the way his fingers stayed curled in my hoodie like he wasn't ready to let go. Neither of us spoke at first. Maybe because words didn't feel necessary. Maybe because neither of us knew what to say. David's forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my lips. His grip on my hoodie loosened slightly, but he didn't move away. "Well," he finally murmured, voice slightly dazed. "That happened." I let out a breathless laugh. "Yeah. Did you... I mean..." He cleared his throat, rubbing the back of his neck like he always did when he was nervous. "Did you mean it? What you said?" I nodded without hesitation. "Yeah, I did." He exhaled, his shoulders sagging like he'd been carrying something heavy for too long. Good. Because if that was just like a heat-of-the-moment thing, I was gonna have to find a way to disappear off the face of the earth. I laughed, shaking my head. "It wasn't. I promise." His grin flickered, uncertain but real. "Okay, cool. Cool, cool, cool." I raised an eyebrow. "You good, dude?" I just kissed my best friend in the middle of nowhere after years of pretending I didn't want to. I don't even know what I'm supposed to feel right now. That hit harder than I expected. Years. He had been pretending too. I swallowed, hard, shifting slightly so I could see his face better. "How long?" I asked quietly. David hesitated, his fingers toying with the hem of his hoodie. "I don't know," he admitted. "At first I thought it was just, I don't know, admiration, or something, And then it got worse. Like, every time you smiled at me, every time you laughed at one of my stupid jokes, every time you stole my fries without asking, I started noticing. And then I couldn't stop. My heart squeezed. He let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. It was so annoying. I kept waiting for it to go away, but it never did. And then tonight, when we were stuck in here, and you were right there, and I kept thinking about how much I wanted to. He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. God, I really am an idiot, huh? I smirked. Yeah, but you're my idiot. David blinked, then grinned. Damn right I am. It was different after that, not in a bad way, not in a way that felt wrong or awkward. Just different, because now there was no more pretending. David didn't pull away when our knees knocked together. He didn't make a joke when I absent-mindedly ran my fingers along his forearm. He didn't overthink it when, hours later, I leaned, my head against his shoulder, and he rested his chin against my hair like it was the most natural thing in the world. He let me touch him, and for the first time, he touched me back. Not the way he used to, not the way best friends did, but the way someone did when they wanted more. Hey, he said after a long silence, his fingers tracing circles against my wrist. What happens when we go back? I lifted my head, meeting his gaze. What do you want to happen? His lips pressed together like he was trying to find the right words. I want this, he finally said. I don't want to pretend like it didn't happen. I don't want to go back to just being your dumbass best friend who steals your food and ruins perfectly good road trips. I smirked. You're still that guy. Okay, true. But now I also want to be the guy who gets to kiss you whenever I want. Something warm bloomed in my chest. That's a pretty good deal. He grinned. Right? I thought so. I exhaled, glancing out the window at the still dark sky. The world outside felt quiet, still, like it was waiting for us to figure ourselves out. There's going to be stuff we have to figure out, I admitted. Like, how we tell people, what this means for us. David nodded. Yeah, and I know it won't be easy. But I don't care. I've wanted this for too long to let stupid details get in the way. I reached for his hand, threading our fingers together. Then we figure it out together. His smile softened. Together. And just like that, the future didn't seem so scary anymore. Morning came quietly. The first hints of light seeped through the windshield, casting a soft glow over the interior of the car. The world outside felt untouched, still wrapped in the stillness of dawn. David stirred beside me, groaning as he stretched, his arm brushing against mine. His eyes cracked open, hazy with sleep, and for a second, he just looked at me, like he was trying to remember if last night had been real or just another dream. Then he smiled, slow, lazy, soft. Morning, he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. I couldn't help but smile back. Morning. For a second, we just lay there, our legs tangled, our hands still loosely intertwined between us. It felt like something out of a different life, one where this had always been normal, always been okay. And maybe it had been, even before we admitted it. David let out a deep sigh and stretched again, muscles shifting beneath his hoodie. So, do we wait for some kind stranger to rescue us, or do we accept that this is our life now? I rolled my eyes. You're the one who got us stranded. You should at least try to look guilty about it. He grinned, completely unrepentant. Worked out though, didn't it? I bit back a laugh. Unbelievable. He reached for my hand again, lazily running his thumb across my knuckles like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe now, it was. So, he said, glancing at me. You still good with this? With us? I squeezed his fingers. Yeah, more than good. His grin softened into something quieter, something real. Cool, he murmured. Then, after a beat, he added, I call shotgun for life, by the way. I groaned, pushing him away. Oh my God. He laughed, catching my wrist and pulling me back in, pressing a quick kiss to my temple before I could protest. Nah, but seriously, I like this. I like us. The words sent warmth curling through my chest. Me too, I admitted. Even if I'm going to regret letting you win every argument from now on. Oh, absolutely, he said, smirking. That's part of the deal. No takebacks. I rolled my eyes, but I was smiling. The world outside was waking up. Birds chirping somewhere in the distance. The sky shifting from gray to pale blue. Soon we'd have to get out of this car. Soon we'd have to figure out how to get back. To reality. How to navigate whatever came next. But for now, there was just this. The quiet space between us. The lingering warmth of his hand in mine. The knowledge that for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Because, whatever it was, we'd figure it out together.